Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janet for Card Runners, and I'm here with a on-the-go hand replayer. And we're going to be playing a no limit 100 hand today, and as usual, we'll talk about what to do with our entire range, not just our hand. So, we are in the button with pocket aces, middle position folds, cut off the limps, we raise to 4, big blind calls, and then the cutoff calls. So already right here, this is going to be a hand where you're going to have to pay more attention to reads than usual, because you're probably not experienced with a cutoff limp calling range, because that's a line that pretty much only fish take. So we have to be a little bit more careful with this hand than we usually do, but we're going to at least get to the point where there's an interesting decision. So right now, we've just played everything very standard. We've opened aces, and if you're playing a lot of tables at once, you're going to mostly be, playing your sort of autopilot, hopefully solid game, and then we can look at reads when we get to a close decision. All right. So in the flop comes 10-9-2. So since we have a fish here, I think you're going to want to just c-bet relatively big. I'm assuming cutoff's a fish. So hero bet 10 here. This is usually a bigger bet than I would like, especially multi-way. And it's probably a good idea to pause. I know it's an on-the-go video, so you're probably not pausing as much. But it might be a good idea to pause and think why I don't usually like to bet as big in position on a 10-9-2 board with a flush draw. And the reason for that is this is a board where it's very hard for your opponents to defend by check calling since position's so valuable. So that encourages them to check raise more aggressively. So for example, if they have a set, if they have a strong draw, they're probably going to check raise here more often than they usually would on most board textures. So because they want to defend by check raising and not check calling, betting smaller forces them to defend wider and forces them to play the next street out of position more often. It does other stuff too, but those are two really important effects. So I usually would prefer a smaller bet here, but since we have a fish, I think the bigger bet can be fine, although I'd probably bet like maybe $1 smaller. And then we get check raised by the big blind. So this is a spot where once we get check raised here, especially if we assume the cutoff's a fish, I would be really careful and really reluctant to stack off here. Now, we might still need to stack off against the big blind if we get a really awesome turn card, but think about what happened. We c-bet this flop, which we're not always going to do. 10-9-2 with a flush draw is not a board where we're going to recklessly c-bet because our opponents can have a lot of pairs and draws and even sets. So we started off by c-betting here, and then the big blind raised even when the cutoff was almost effectively yet to act. You're not usually going to see the big blind or the cutoff donk bet here. So since the cutoff just checked on the flop, he really hasn't shown strength or weakness yet, and the big blind's already raising. If the cutoff's a fish, he might not even fold a pair or a draw to this raise, so it makes me think the big blind either has a really strong hand or a draw here, and he's probably very unlikely to actually have a bluff. And if we're going to end up defending with aces comfortably, we're usually going to want to put bluffs in our opponent's range. So here, I might even be folding to a bet on a blank turn, which I really don't like having to do. It's a very close spot that's very tricky because it's hard to tell exactly what the big blind's range is because we're in such a unique spot due to the cutoff limping and calling. So I don't think I like a flop fold here, but I might not hate it. And the reason for that, again, is just the cutoff is making a raise when a fish has yet to act on a board where we can have so many draws and so many strong hands in our range, and the fish can have strong hands too or just pairs he won't fold. So you're very rarely going to find me hero fold, and I would never, ever hero fold this against regs. But it might be possible to do this here against a fish to just muck on the flop because I'm still not really going to feel that comfortable stacking off on a blank turn. And our opponent could easily be just check raising the flop with just draws and sets in 2 pair. And so now when the turn card comes, he's going to end up betting or jamming or, probably not jamming, but at least betting. And then we still have a very tough decision even on a blank turn. So I wouldn't hate this fold. I don't hate a call. All right, so let's continue. And we end up calling, which is what I expect is probably considered the standard line here. Most people would probably agree that's best. Although, as I said, I really don't know if I hate a flop fold. It depends on a lot of the cutoff stats, which I don't have. Okay, so the big blind. Now, on the turn, we have a little bit less than a pot and a half size bet left. And what's just important to notice here is even though this turn card is reasonably blank, I realize 7-8 got here, but 7-8 usually doesn't check raise the flop, especially when the fish is involved. So we get a reasonably blank turn, but it's still not that difficult for our opponent to balance a range of like nut type hands and draws by just jamming the turn. It's actually quite easy to do. And there's no real strategy we have that can defend effectively against that. So if our opponent was just check raising draws and sets on the flop, on the turn it's going to be very easy for him to just jam those really, really strong hands and combo draws. And that's what makes calling the flop less effective than it otherwise would be. In theory, do we need to call the flop check raise? Of course. But in practice with the fish, maybe against some people we can get away from it. So let's see what our opponent does. So he checks the turn, which is pretty surprising to me, because I expect most people to keep barreling with their draws and their really strong hands. He might have checked because he's uncomfortable with what he thinks are awkward stack sizes, but I don't have any problem at all with jamming this turn for like 1.4 pot size bets left, because any hand that bluffs is going to have so much equity. So we end up checking the turn, and then, okay, so we checked back on the flop. I don't think I like that. I would prefer to bet the flop and then check call if he goes all in, which I think will happen decently often. And the reason why I like that is because I think we could have, we can easily have a draw on this turn. We could have called our opponent's, flop check raise with many a draw. And I don't think our opponent will want to risk giving free cards when he has us beat on this turn. I think there's so many draws on the turn that he can represent. There's so many draws we can have. I don't think he's willing to take the risk of us checking back, which is a huge risk if he has like a set or two pair. So since I don't think he's willing to take that risk, I would just bet the turn. And then if he check raises all in, I would just assume he's going to have a draw more than enough to make it a profitable call. Lastly, we might not want to give free cards here. So for example, if our opponent was check raise bluffing the flop with, let's say, 9-7 of clubs, something like that, we don't really want to give free cards. We can still get outdrawn here. So I would definitely bet call this turn once we get here. I wasn't expecting our opponent to check to us very often on the turn, which is why I thought the flop might be close. But once it does check to us on the turn, I'm feeling really happy, especially if the turn's blankish like we got. So I would definitely bet call here. So the other thing to remember is if we check back this turn, there are just about no blanks on the river. It pretty much has to be like a 5, 4, 3, or 2, not of diamonds and arguably not of spades. So when you check back here, you're constantly going to be lost on the river, and I'm guessing that's where one of the questions in this hand is what do you do on the river when the river card comes like a 7 of clubs? All right, and just my luck, we get the blankest river card possible, which is the 2 of hearts. So once our opponent bets here, folding is obviously not going to be good because our hand's just too strong and our opponent showed weakness by checking the turn. So it's going to be between calling or raising. I would probably just call here because the problem with raising is raising does well if our opponent has hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, ace 10, king 10, but I don't really see how those hands are in his range. So since he check raised the flop, I expect his range to overall be very polarized after this turn in river. So I don't think our river raise is going to be better than calling because I don't think we'll win over half the time when called. So I would prefer to just call this flop here. And we do, and we beat his misdraw. Okay, so I don't look ahead to see like the turn or the river before I start talking about the flop. So I just got kind of lucky here that this guy had more or less what I expected him to have. So I think the things to really remember about this hand is on the flop check raise is probably going to be a very easy call in theory. Exploitatively, you might be able to fold because I imagine if you look at this flop, and if you were in the big blind here, my guess is most people that are watching this video would not check raise bluff on this flop in this position because it's just not a good spot to check raise bluff. There's a fish, you're out of position, and the button bet multi-way on a super dry board. So maybe exploitatively you could fold the flop, though most people will probably call, and the standard line is going to be to call, and for sure the theoretically correct line is going to be to not fold. Okay, so we call the flop. The turn, I think, is the street I feel the most passionately about because I just don't see how we're beat once he checks. And if you look, even though we got lucky on the river to get value from his misdraw, we would have stacked him if we bet the turn. And I don't think our opponent's always going to bet in the misdraw on the river after his check raise fails. Because I don't really like the opponent's line here all that much. And I think we just kind of got lucky that we still got, $43 from him betting the river. So definitely bet this turn. Don't feel silly if you get stacked. Like, think about it. Think about how big of a risk it is for your opponent to check a hand that's better than aces on the turn. And if he happened to take that risk with pocket nines, gold star for him because I don't mean gold star like it's a good line. I just mean it like he got lucky he's going to end up stacking us because all the time we can check back the turn with a draw or with a hand that he probably could have gotten value from if he kept betting. So it's just not going to be that effective for him to check very strong hands very often on the turn. So I would definitely have bet called the turn with aces. So, hope you enjoyed watching the video. Hope you learned a bunch. Good luck, everyone, and take care.